My name is Kendra Ross. I'm 26. I work nights in an ER, and according to my own mother, I'm a leech. She didn't say it in a fight in the hallway or whisper it under her breath. She said it standing at the head of our Thanksgiving table, one hand on the carving knife, the other wrapped around a wine glass. To Kendra, she announced, looking right at me, our little leech. November is your last month under this roof. Time to finally grow up. The room went silent so fast I could hear the furnace humming in the basement. My sister stared at her plate. My stepdad cleared his throat and pretended to slice more turkey that nobody wanted. Someone's kid asked what a leech was, and an adult laughed it off like it was a joke. Nobody said, "That's too far." Nobody said, "She pays for half this meal." They all just waited for me to explode, to cry, to beg. I didn't. I cut a piece of turkey, swallowed it past the lump in my throat, and said the only words I trusted myself with. Pass the gravy. On the outside, I played along, nodded at the fake small talk, let the night crawl to an end. On the inside, something snapped into place. If they really thought I was just a leech, then losing me shouldn't hurt at all. So by the time that house went to sleep, I'd already decided exactly what I was going to pack, which bills I was going to end, and how I was going to leave without a single word. I just didn't expect who would show up at my new door the very next day, acting like nothing had changed. If you've ever been treated like a burden in your own family, stay with me to the end of this story. And if you haven't already, hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss what happened after I walked out of that house. It felt strange waking up the next day with my thoughts sharper than my emotions, as if my mind had decided long ago what my heart was only now catching up to. That clarity made it easier to trace back the long line of things that brought me to that table, even though none of it had exploded in one night. It had built up quietly, the way cold creeps through the walls of old houses in Rochester, slow, unnoticed, and suddenly, everywhere. I had moved back into my mother's home more than a year earlier when my mother, Lorraine Ross, went through a health scare. Nothing dramatic, but enough for me to feel responsible. Leaving my apartment and moving into her place felt temporary at first, like choosing the practical path. I worked nights in an ER, rarely saw daylight, and saving money on rent felt like the only smart decision I'd made in a long time. And for a while, I convinced myself that being the dependable daughter was a role I didn't mind stepping back into. Her husband, my stepfather, Victor Ross, didn't argue when I carried my boxes in. He didn't argue about anything unless it benefited him. He treated my presence like another household convenience, quiet, available, useful. I didn't notice it immediately, but eventually I realized that every time something broke or every time a bill arrived, he waited for me to take care of it as naturally as turning on a light switch. He had the uncanny ability to disappear whenever responsibility entered the room. Then there was my sister, Cynthia Hale, the shining example of how Lorraine believed a daughter should be. Married, a mother, with a house and a schedule that looked neat on paper even if the reality was chaotic. Cynthia didn't hesitate to lean on me whenever she needed a babysitter or someone to cover the spaces she left open. I told myself I didn't mind. I told myself I was helping. But the truth was less noble. I just wanted to avoid disappointing anyone. I'd spent my whole life trying to be the version of myself my family could accept, even if that version barely resembled the person I was becoming. The convenience of having me at home gradually turned into expectation. The expectation became dependence, and dependence, in their language, translated into silence. No acknowledgments, no thanks, not even an occasional nod. Whenever something worked in that house, it worked because I handled it. The internet plan was under my name. The gas bill was on my account. The electric bill, water, even the streaming services, my card, every single one, month after month. I kept telling myself it wasn't a big deal, that I could afford it, that family helped family. But somewhere in the back of my mind, I knew I was holding up more weight than anyone cared to admit. The strange part was how invisible the effort felt to them. When the fridge was full, they assumed it had always been full. When heat flowed through the vents during the cold Rochester winters, they assumed it flowed on its own. When the Wi-Fi connected instantly, no one imagined it came from the same paycheck that covered my scrubs, my rent contribution, my loans. It was easier for them to see me as the one who had come back home than the one who kept the home standing. Even my mother, Lorraine, used my presence as a way to maintain the illusion that her house was still functioning smoothly. She liked people to believe everything was under control, that she was the kind of woman whose adult daughters came home out of affection, not necessity. And whenever I tried to talk about boundaries or share the strain I felt, she treated it as if I were being ungrateful, as if having a room in her house erased the years of support I'd quietly taken on. The imbalance wasn't loud. It wasn't violent. It grew in the spaces where gratitude should have lived. Every small dismissal, every shrug, every reminder that I was still figuring things out, pushed me a little further away. And the more I stepped in to fill the gaps, the less anyone noticed I was doing it. By the time the holidays approached, the pattern felt permanent. Lorraine had perfected her subtle comparisons, Cynthia, the accomplished one, me, the unsettled one. Victor assumed I would cover anything he forgot. Cynthia assumed I had endless time and energy, and I assumed none of them would ever truly see the cost of the role I played. The fault line was already there. The ground had already shifted. What happened at Thanksgiving didn't create the break. It simply revealed it. I had spent so long trying to rationalize their expectations that I barely noticed how far I'd drifted from myself. The more I tried to hold everything together, the more invisible I became in the house I helped keep warm. Looking back, the signs had always been there. The exhaustion in my chest after double shifts. The resentment I tried to swallow whenever my phone lit up with another request. The quiet ache whenever I realized I couldn't remember the last time anyone asked how I was doing without needing something in return. I had convinced myself this was what loyalty looked like. But loyalty without acknowledgement isn't loyalty at all. It's erosion, steady, silent, and devastating. And by the time November pressed in with its early darkness and heavy skies, the erosion had already hollowed out everything I thought I had left to give. Morning settled over me before I was ready to face it. The kind of morning that didn't ask permission to arrive. I sat on the edge of my bed for a few minutes, letting the stillness press against my chest. There was no plan written out, no checklist taped to the wall. Yet everything in me moved with the calm certainty of someone who had already rehearsed this moment in the quiet corners of her mind. I didn't need anger to guide me. Clarity was enough. The first thing I did was pull my laptop onto my lap and open the browser. The routine of logging into various accounts had become so familiar that my fingers moved without hesitation. The internet service was under my name, the one bill I had never missed. I stared at the account page for a moment, not out of sentiment, but because it was strange realizing how much responsibility I had carried without ever calling it responsibility. Then I pressed the button. Service scheduled to end. Confirmation email received a second later. It felt precise, almost surgical. Not an act of vengeance, just a boundary drawn cleanly. Next were the utilities. Gas first, then electric, then water. Each account carried months of payments I'd made automatically, never pausing to consider how unusual it was for someone my age to be paying for an entire household that wasn't truly hers. Turning off autopay felt like sliding a heavy weight off my shoulders. There was no guilt in the motions, only an unexpected sensation of reclaiming something I had given away too freely. Subscriptions came after. Streaming platforms, cloud storage, small monthly services that seemed harmless individually, but added up in ways no one else ever acknowledged. I changed passwords methodically, one after another, marveling at how quietly I had set up the digital world the entire household depended on. None of them had ever asked where these conveniences came from. They simply assumed they existed. When my accounts were handled, I finally turned to the room itself. Packing didn't take long. I owned fewer things than most people my age, partly because my schedule left little time for hobbies, partly because living with my mother made me feel as though the space wasn't truly mine to fill. Clothes, work scrubs, a few books, a shoebox of letters, a folder of financial documents. Everything fit into 2 bags and an old duffel I kept from college. I didn't linger over objects or attempt to preserve memories that had already faded. There was no need to make the moment heavier than it already was. The house around me remained quiet. No footsteps in the hallway, no creak of the bathroom door, no sound from the kitchen. It struck me how often I had adapted myself to not disturb anyone, always moving gently, always accommodating. That habit felt unnecessary now. I walked down the hallway with my bags in hand and didn't look back at the room I had slept in for months. It had never felt like a sanctuary, just a temporary landing spot in a place that used my presence more than it welcomed it. I set my keys on the kitchen counter. Not carefully, not dramatically, just placed them there so there would be no question later. If they wanted to know why the heat flickered or why the Wi-Fi stopped working, they wouldn't be able to pretend they didn't understand. The keys made a soft sound against the counter, a tiny punctuation mark at the end of an unspoken sentence. Leaving the house felt different than I expected. I had imagined tension in my chest, a final surge of doubt, maybe even a whisper of guilt. But the air outside was cold and clean, and the weight I anticipated never came. It wasn't an escape. It wasn't even defiance. It was simply the next step in a truth I had already accepted, that I couldn't keep living in a place that saw me as a placeholder rather than a person. I loaded my bags into the back seat of my car. The engine started without hesitation, humming in a way that felt reassuring. The streets of Rochester were quiet, the kind of quiet that usually made me feel small. But today, it felt like space. Room to breathe, room to think, room to exist without being measured against someone else's expectations. As I pulled away from the house, I didn't check the mirrors for a final glimpse. The life behind me wasn't something I needed to memorialize. The only thing that mattered was the path ahead, however uncertain or imperfect it might be. And for the first time in a long time, the uncertainty didn't scare me. When I reached the small apartment I'd secured earlier in the week, I carried my bags upstairs one at a time. The stairwell smelled like dust and old paint, but it felt honest in a way the house I'd left never had. I unlocked the door, stepped inside, and set my things down on the scuffed wooden floor. It wasn't much, but it was mine. Every crack, every imperfection, every inch of space belonged to me and no one else. There was no need to declare anything or assign meaning to the moment. Standing in that quiet apartment, I simply allowed myself to exist without carrying anyone else's weight. And for now, that was enough. The evening settled in quietly, the kind of quiet that doesn't ask for permission, just spreads itself across the walls until it becomes part of the air. Standing in the middle of my new apartment, I realized how unfamiliar the silence felt. Not uncomfortable, just different, like discovering space I hadn't known I needed. There were no footsteps overhead, no clatter in the kitchen, no murmurs drifting down a hallway. Just the soft hum of the radiator struggling against another cold night in Rochester. I sat on the floor with my back against the wall, letting the emptiness of the room wrap around me. The place wasn't much. The paint was chipped in spots, and the floor curved just slightly near the entryway, but it grounded me in a way that made the chaos I'd left behind feel distant. The simplicity felt earned. For once, I wasn't trying to shrink myself to keep from intruding. I didn't have to calculate how much noise I made or consider how anyone else might interpret my presence. This was the first space in years where every corner belonged to me. My phone buzzed for the first time a little after sunset. The sound echoed in the apartment, sharp enough to cut through the calm. I didn't pick it up immediately. Instead, I watched the screen glow on the floor beside my bag. A message preview appeared, the familiar contact name sitting at the top. It didn't surprise me. It only reinforced a truth I'd been circling around all day. The moment I stepped out of that house, a balance they never noticed had shifted. The message was short, almost dismissive in tone, as if nothing significant had occurred. A simple question about the Wi-Fi, phrased like routine maintenance. It was strange how easy it was for them to treat my labor like a default setting, something they assumed would continue even without me physically there. The expectation itself felt heavier than the words. I didn't open the message. I didn't need to. The preview told me enough about what they were really asking. Return to the role they'd built for me. Keep their world running. Pretend none of the last 24 hours had meaning. Another message arrived shortly after, this one longer, more frazzled at the edges. Not frantic, not apologetic, just uncomfortable in a way that suggested inconvenience rather than concern. It mentioned a movie not loading and a child upset. The subtext was clear. Even in my absence, they expected my patience to stretch across the distance, to fill the holes they'd never bothered to patch themselves. I placed the phone face down on the floor. The weight of the silence that followed felt strangely liberating. With the apartment dimly lit by a single lamp I'd brought from the old house, I allowed myself to lie back and stare at the ceiling. The plaster was uneven, textured in a way that caught shadows and made them shift with every small movement of the lamp's glow. The imperfections felt almost comforting, a reminder that not everything had to be polished to serve a purpose. I wasn't looking for perfection, just a place where I didn't have to justify my existence. The air inside the apartment was cold, but not unkind. The radiator clanked sporadically, fighting to warm the room. In my mother's house, heat was something that flowed effortlessly, unnoticed, because I made sure it did. Here, warmth felt like a collaboration between the building and me, a fragile truce that made me appreciate every bit of comfort the room struggled to give. I wrapped myself in an old sweatshirt and listened to the pipes settle. Night deepened, and the glow from streetlights outside cast faint stripes across the floor. I hadn't realized how exhausted I was until my breathing slowed and the tension in my shoulders eased. The absence of obligations was almost dizzying. No one calling my name down a hallway. No one asking for a favor. No one hinting that I wasn't doing enough. Even my own thoughts felt quieter, more contained. No longer overshadowed by the constant pressure to anticipate someone else's needs. As I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to relax into the silence, my phone lit again. The buzz was softer this time, almost hesitant. I didn't touch it. I let it fade on its own, returning the room to stillness. The choice not to respond didn't feel vindictive. It felt necessary. A way of marking a boundary I should have drawn long ago. The world on the other side of those messages no longer defined me, and I didn't owe it my energy. Eventually, I stood and looked around the apartment once more. The bare walls, the empty floor, the single lamp, everything felt like a blank beginning, not a loss. I didn't know what the next day would bring. I didn't know what adjustments I would have to make, or how long it would take before the space fully felt like home. But in that moment, the uncertainty wasn't frightening. The quiet wasn't a threat. It was a pause, a rare chance to hear my own thoughts without interruption. For the first time in a long time, the night belonged entirely to me. Morning arrived with a low haze drifting through the apartment windows, giving the room a muted softness that didn't match the tension building in my chest. I'd barely finished organizing a small stack of essentials when a sudden, deliberate knock echoed through the hallway. The sound cut through the stillness in a way that told me it wasn't a delivery, a neighbor, or a mistake. It carried a weight I recognized instantly, a weight I had hoped I wouldn't have to face this soon. The moment I opened the door, the expression on Victor Ross's face told me everything I needed to know. He looked out of place against the worn frame of my apartment, like someone pulled out of a familiar script and dropped into a scene he didn't understand. The discomfort in his eyes wasn't concern, it was disruption. Something in his carefully maintained world had slipped, and he had come to restore it. He stepped inside without waiting, scanning the apartment as if trying to measure the gap between the life he expected me to live and the one I was choosing instead. I could feel the judgment in the way he glanced at the empty shelves and the plain walls, but what struck me more was the irritation beneath it. Not worry. Irritation. As if my absence had inconvenienced him more than it had unsettled the household. There was no need for him to speak for me to understand why he was there. The look on his face held a familiar urgency, the kind that had appeared in small ways over the past year whenever something in the house didn't function the way he wanted. Heat, internet, streaming, payments he'd never tracked because he assumed someone else would. That someone had always been me. Standing there now, watching him shift his weight, I felt the full reality of what I'd carried for so long. None of them had ever been responsible for the structure that kept their lives comfortable, and now that structure had collapsed the moment I stepped away. It wasn't surprising, but seeing the consequences appear so quickly gave me a clarity I hadn't expected. As he stood in the center of my apartment, I let my thoughts run through the long list of responsibilities I had quietly taken on. The electric bill, the gas line, the streaming accounts, the small conveniences no one had ever paused to appreciate. All those invisible threads I'd woven into the household, threads no one noticed until they snapped. The silence that followed was thick with everything he wasn't saying, and everything I had known for months but had refused to acknowledge. Being confronted so soon after leaving might have rattled me under different circumstances, but instead it made something crystallize inside me. I saw clearly the roles we had all played. Victor's frustration wasn't rooted in care. It was rooted in the sudden realization that he now had to pick up tasks he had ignored for years, tasks he didn't understand, didn't want, and didn't know how to handle. The ease of blaming me was gone because I was no longer part of the machinery that kept the household running. He looked at me in a way that suggested he expected explanation, apology, reversal, something to make his appearance worthwhile. But there was nothing inside me that matched those expectations. The emotional distance between us had grown steadily over time, widening every time he dismissed the work I did or the strain I carried. Now, standing inches from me, he felt like a stranger demanding access to a version of me that no longer existed. My mind drifted to the countless moments when I'd covered for the family without hesitation. Long shifts followed by late-night payments, small repairs, solutions to problems they didn't know existed. I remembered the exhaustion that clung to me on days when everything pressed down at once. My job, their demands, the silence that swallowed any acknowledgement I might have hoped for. I had been a source, a function, a tool, rarely a person. Seeing Victor here, in this place I had built for myself, made it clear how deeply that dynamic had rooted itself. The urgency in his presence didn't reflect concern for me, it reflected fear of losing access to what I provided. There was something sobering in that realization, something both painful and liberating. I didn't owe explanations to a man who had never truly seen me. I didn't owe comfort to a household that only valued me when I made their lives easier. He waited, as if expecting me to fill the silence with solutions, but silence, for once, felt like power. It filled the room with a steadiness I hadn't felt in years. Without raising my voice or justifying a single decision, I let him stand in the truth of what my absence meant. Not punishment, not revenge. Just a boundary drawn so firmly in the ground that neither of us could pretend it wasn't there. I didn't move toward him. I didn't open the door wider. I didn't offer anything to soften the moment. The only thing I allowed myself to feel was the quiet certainty that I had finally stepped out of a role that never should have been mine in the first place. The apartment settled into a familiar stillness after Victor left, a stillness that wrapped around me like a reminder that this space finally belonged to me alone. I moved through the room slowly, adjusting a stack of folded blankets, shifting a small lamp closer to the corner, letting my hands drift over the surfaces I could call my own. The quiet didn't feel like emptiness. It felt like a boundary holding its shape. The air carried a strange brightness, almost as if the walls themselves had exhaled after years of pressure I didn't realize I'd been carrying. I hadn't expected the house to unravel so quickly after I walked away, but the steady rhythm of notifications that began to gather on my phone made it clear how deeply my absence had cut through their routines. Each alert vibrated across the countertop like a small knock asking to be let inside. I didn't rush to read them. The mere sound of the phone buzzing was enough to tell me that someone back home had realized a new problem they couldn't fix. When I finally glanced at the screen, I saw the pattern immediately. Missed calls, text previews stacked one after another, timestamps creeping across the morning hours. None of them held anger the way I would have expected. Instead, I sensed disorientation, a quiet panic slipping through the cracks of every message. It was the kind of shift that happened when certainty evaporated all at once. The tone I recognized best was desperation disguised as concern. My mind drifted over the years that built up to this moment, the many times I absorbed responsibility without acknowledging its weight. I remembered evenings when I dragged myself home after shifts at the hospital, drained but still alert enough to pay attention to the things no one else noticed. The overdue statement on the counter, the blinking router, the thermostat running hotter than it should. I picked up every detail instinctively because the household only worked if someone did. And that someone had always been me. Now, seeing the incoming messages pile up, I realized how deeply they had depended on the structure I created behind the scenes. The illusion of stability had always rested not on family unity, but on my willingness to fill the gaps everyone else stepped around. As soon as I stepped back, the gaps widened into something they couldn't ignore. The next wave of notifications came in softer, almost hesitant, as if the senders weren't sure how much space they still had in my life. A few names I expected appeared on the screen, each carrying their own brand of unease. There was a faint thread running through all of them, a plea layered under excuses, a suggestion that I should return because it would be the reasonable thing, the implication that distance would only make things harder. For them, not for me. As I scrolled, the realization struck with quiet force. They were not reaching out because they wanted to understand me. They were reaching out because they couldn't function without what I provided. It was a distinction I had ignored for too long, and seeing it now made something settle inside me like a heavy truth finally landing in its rightful place. The room around me felt sturdier as the thought grew clearer. I wasn't responsible for the consequences they now faced. I wasn't responsible for fixing the aftermath of decisions they made without considering what it cost me. I wasn't responsible for soothing the discomfort that came from being confronted with their own neglect. What they felt now wasn't grief. It was loss of convenience. The more the messages came in, the more I sensed a shift I hadn't allowed myself to name before. My pulse didn't quicken, my chest didn't tighten. I didn't feel the familiar pull to smooth things over. Instead, I felt a widening distance that didn't hurt. It steadied me. This wasn't retaliation. It wasn't even anger anymore. It was clarity. The kind that forms when a person steps outside the structure that once defined them and realizes how small that structure actually was. I knew I would keep receiving messages. maybe even more frantic ones, but none of them had the power to undo the boundary I had drawn. The phone buzzed again, vibrating against the countertop in a steady rhythm. I let it ring. I didn't need to read every word to understand what they were asking. The household was unraveling, the roles were collapsing, and the silence on my end was louder than any argument I could have offered. I stepped away from the phone, letting it buzz unanswered while I pulled open a window to let in a breath of cold air. The breeze slipped into the room and carried a quiet sharpness that reminded me why I left. It reminded me that not every call demanded a response, not every plea required a return, and not every crisis belonged to me. The messages kept coming, but the distance between us had already settled, firm and unshakable. For the first time, the weight wasn't on my shoulders. The consequences were landing exactly where they belonged. Time kept moving after everything broke. I went to work, came back to my small apartment, paid my own bills, and built routines that belonged only to me. The house in Rochester where I grew up became just another address, not the center of my life. The fallout followed by mail. Envelopes showed up in my mailbox with my name stamped across the front, listing balances for gas, electric, and services I had set up for a family I no longer lived with. One letter came from the property management company for my mother's rental. Utility shutoffs and unpaid amounts were now a problem for the lease. My name sat in the middle of the page as the primary account holder. I had left the house, but on paper I was still tied to it. If I wanted a clean future, I had to cut those strings. That was when my aunt, Nadine, stepped in. She had always stayed at the edge of family drama, seeing more than she said. Now she was the first person to reach out without asking me to come back or fix anything. When Nadine came to my apartment, she brought a folder full of copies and notes. She had already called the landlord and the utility companies. At my small table, she laid out every page with my name on it and calmly explained what needed to be done so I could walk away without debt or damage. For the first time, someone treated my situation as something unfair to me, not as an inconvenience to everyone else. Signing the forms felt heavier than I expected. With every signature, one more thread tying me to that house loosened. I was not erasing the help I had given. I was ending the assumption that it would never stop. News about the old house reached me in fragments. Nadine mentioned that the landlord refused to renew the lease without a bigger deposit after the utility trouble. My mother and Victor had to move into a smaller place they could actually afford. Cynthia picked up extra hours and arranged childcare that did not depend on me. Their lives adjusted to what they could carry on their own. It did not feel like revenge. It felt like things finally matched reality. My own life became simple and solid. I picked up extra shifts when I wanted more savings, not because I was afraid of another surprise bill. I bought small things for my apartment because they made it feel like home. I stocked my pantry with food I chose. Paying my own utilities felt straightforward. I knew what I used and what I owed, and no one else's comfort hid behind my name. Sometimes my phone still lit up with messages from my mother. Some tried to soften the past, as if careful wording could rewrite what was said at that table. Others leaned on guilt and history. I read them less and replied even less. Distance did not erase the years between us, but it finally put a limit on what those years could demand. The word that split everything open stayed with me for a while. Leech. It sat in the back of my mind, sharp and ugly. But as my days filled with choices that were finally mine, the label started to fall apart. It did not match the facts. It fit the people who needed a story where I was the problem. One night, sitting at my own table with a simple dinner and a few notes from work, the whole thing finally came into focus. This was never just about heat, Wi-Fi, or whose name appeared on which bill. It was about who gets to define the value of your effort while standing on top of it. It was about how quickly people call you selfish the moment you stop letting them take without limit. If there is a lesson in all of this, it is that being needed is not the same as being respected. Carrying your family does not mean you owe them your future or your silence. Sometimes the clearest way to protect yourself is to stand up from a table where you are fed blame instead of gratitude and walk away without apologizing. I did not plan anyone's hardship. I did not sabotage their life. I simply stepped out of the space where I had been absorbing all the consequences. The house adjusted to my absence because it had to. I adjusted to my freedom because I finally chose to. They learned what life looked like without the person they once called a leech. And I learned, beyond any doubt, that I had never been one at all.